This is Dr. Christy Webb, and I'm a psychologist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Many people who have viewed my videos have asked that I make one on the topic of borderline personality disorder in men. So that's the topic of this video. First of all, let's start by reviewing what the symptoms of borderline personality disorder are. Remembering that you can't get the diagnosis until you are 18, and that these symptoms have to be present across a variety of contexts. So not just with your family of origin, not just in your partnership, not just at work, not just on the weekends when you're partying. They have to be present across a variety of contexts and over time. There are 9 symptom criteria. 1. Frantic attempts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So this is the person who becomes depressed or even suicidal when a romance breaks up or when a friend moves away or just grow apart. 2. Unstable and intense interpersonal relationships. So that means that you can go from hero to zero in under 2 seconds if you didn't return their phone call quickly enough, for example. 3, an unstable self-image. They don't know who they are, who they want to be, what interests them, whether they like vanilla or chocolate. 4, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that have the potential to be self-damaging. So reckless driving or unsafe sex or overspending or drinking, drugging. 5, suicidality or self-mutilation, cutting, burning. 6, notable mood reactivity. So we talk about emotional lability. That means that the emotions are on a roller coaster. Number 7, chronic feelings of emptiness. Number 8, intense episodic anger. Wow, what a temper this person can have. And number 9, under stress, transient paranoia or even dissociation, that feeling that you've left your body, that you're looking in the corner of the room looking back down on yourself. Okay, 9 symptoms. So why is BPD diagnosed so much more often in women than in men? And it's a fact. It is. I know that lots of you have become very angry with me. You've let me know because I will sometimes use the pronoun she, and I probably use it more often than I say he or she or they when I record my videos. But this is a fact. More women than men are diagnosed with the disorder. That does not mean, as we're about to learn, that more women than men have the disorder. So why would more women than men be diagnosed with it? Well, one reason is that research tends to look only at people who are already in the mental health system. And there's more women than men in the mental health system. More women than men tend to seek help. 2, it depends very much on how symptoms are assessed. Is it self-report? Am I talking about myself? In which case I might have a vested interest in either downplaying my symptoms or exaggerating them in order to get help. Or are we relying on a report of a family member, a roommate, a colleague? 3, we know from research that clinicians do have a subtle, even unconscious bias toward diagnosing BPD more in women than in men. In fact, there's some research that suggests that the way the symptom criteria are written is subtly biased towards a description of women rather than a description of men. Finally, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, which is what we now use instead of the DSM, they're both categorical. They're an on-off switch. You have the diagnosis or you don't. They're not nuanced in any way. So you need 5 out of the 9 symptoms in order to be assigned the diagnosis. But what if you have only 4? Well, according to the DSM and the ICD, you don't have BPD. But you could still look very BPD-ish, especially if you have suicidality, and not make the diagnosis because you only have 4 out of 9 symptoms. And you could have 2 different people, each with 5 symptoms, but they could be only overlapping in one. They each may have 4 symptoms that are completely different, each from the other, and only share 1 symptom in common. They'll both qualify for the diagnosis, but can look very different. which leads us into, what does the research say about prevalence? Well, some of the research says that more women than men have BPD. Some of the research says that more men than women have BPD. Psychology is so much fun, isn't it? And some epidemiological research, that means out in the community, like taking the population of an entire city, say St. Louis, epidemiological research says that the diagnosis is equally distributed between men and women, says that about 1.4% of the general population meets criteria for the diagnosis, and that there's a difference in how it looks in clinical populations, that is, in those people who seek help. So the most recent research, in short, says, yeah, about equal prevalence, equal distribution, but there are differences in presentation. Oh, what are those differences in presentation? So there may even be gender-specific traits. In other words, the disorder may be different in men than it is in women. The explosive temper is much more characteristic of men than women. That's the eighth out of 9 symptoms. Substance abuse is far more common in men than in women. So when we talk about impulsivity in at least 2 areas that have the potential to be self-harming or damaging, substance abuse is going to show up more often in men than in women. Women are going to show up more often with, for example, an eating disorder, more often than men will. Men will have higher levels of novelty seeking, so, for example, reckless driving. Men are also more likely to show traits of paranoia, narcissism, antisocial traits, what we sometimes call psychopathic traits, sadistic and or passive-aggressive personality traits. They are also much more likely to show up in the criminal justice system than in mental health clinics. Finally, there's this really interesting developmental trajectory that the research on this is pretty new. It's within the last couple of years. That in boys who end up with BPD, getting that diagnosis, that we are able to see that they had separation anxiety in infancy, body image concerns in childhood, and that by the time they hit adolescence, they were having impulsivity, that chronic emptiness, and some odd thinking. Now, huge caution, neon letters, underlined, highlighted, just because your roommate is a man who is substance abusing and has an explosive temper does not mean that he has borderline personality disorder. That is only one of a number of diagnoses that he could have, or he could simply be a jerk. Just because your little boy has separation anxiety or had it in infancy and now as a child is showing some body image concerns does not mean that he is destined to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Correlation is not causation. That's very important to remember here. These are descriptors so far. That's where the research is. I think it's really interesting that we're beginning to look at what that trajectory is that lands us at the other end in some boys and young men, lands us at borderline personality disorder. So thank you to those of you who reached out to me and asked me please to make a video on BPD in men. I've tried to present what is the most up-to-date, most current research, and I hope that you found it informative. Thanks for watching.